In 2007, standing in the very same hall in Munich, Vladimir Putin shocked the world. He launched a fierce condemnation of US unipolar dominance, NATO expansion, and the post-Cold War order. At the same time, Western leaders dismissed it as a bitter rant from a fading power. 19 years later, at the 2025 and 2026 Munich Security Conference, the world is shocked again, but this time the wrecking ball isn't just coming from the Kremlin. It is coming from the very heart of the West. The parallel between Putin's 27 speech and the rhetoric of Marco Rubio and the Trump-Pence administration today is chilling. They are telling us exactly who they are and what they intend to do. The theme of this year's conference, Under Destruction, isn't just a metaphor. It is a documented demolition of the world's international system. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. If you're interested in geopolitics, here I talk about global power shifts, strategic competition, and the forces reshaping world affairs. The Munich Security Conference was held a bit more than a week ago, and it was a reflection of the state of geopolitics today. This conference has been, for over 60 years, the most important independent forum for world leaders, diplomats, and military brass to discuss current affairs. And this year, it explored the ideological divide between Europe and the United States, the European reaction to this new reality, the state of conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and security in general, and the destruction of the post-Second World War international system. Unfortunately, all their videos are copyrighted, so I won't be able to show you the clips of the conference, but they are linked in the description of this video as well as the sources I used. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio took the stage not just as a diplomat, but as a prophet of a new, narrower West. His speech was an indictment of the global order. He argued that the West outsourced its sovereignty to international institutions while funding massive welfare states at the expense of its own defense. He called climate policy a cult that is impoverishing people, while competitors exploit the very energy resources that the West has banned. But the core of Rubio's message was civilizational. He spoke of a West not bound by abstract rules, but by Christian faith, culture, ancestry, and the sacrifices of forefathers. This is a massive shift. Rubio is signaling that the US no longer cares about a rules-based order that includes everyone. They care about a Western heritage alliance that excludes the woke and borderless. It is why Trump demands reciprocity and seriousness from Europe. To them, the UN is a failure. Rubio boasted that it wasn't the UN that freed the hostages in Gaza or brought Ukraine to the table, it was American leadership. He even touted the precision bombing of Iran and the capture of Venezuelan dictator by US special forces as proof that hard power is the only true currency. So there is a massive irony there. Rubio blames the UN for having no answer, but the US is the primary architect of that indecision. Since 1945, the US has used the Security Council veto roughly 83 times, more than any other permanent member except for the USSR. Crucially, a huge portion of those vetoes were used to shield Israel from resolutions regarding Gaza and the West Bank. The US has systematically used its veto to prevent the UN from acting and then uses this inaction as a pretext to dismantle the institution. There is also a difference of vision here. In his view, defense is paramount and spending for a welfare state a misuse of money. This is very, very different from the European perspective, which places the quality of life of its citizens at the center of political objectives. This doesn't mean that defense should not be taken seriously, but also that doesn't mean that welfare states should be abandoned to the benefit of the defense budget. But obviously this is reflected in the massive US defense budget and barely existent welfare states there, as opposed to European budget that allocate more to healthcare, education, etc. It is very clearly a different vision. Today, the main security threats to European security have proven to be Russia, which cannot really win its war in Ukraine, and ironically, the US, to a certain degree with this whole Greenland crisis and undermining confidence in Article 5. So I can't help but wonder if he's talking about the US when he says that countries have invested in the most rapid military buildup of all human history and have not hesitated to use hard power to pursue their own interests. On the climate challenge that he calls a cult to impoverish people, well, this is the exact opposite. Climate change is threatening the lives of many and their way of life. Up to 34% of EU population and 40% of its territory are experiencing seasonal water scarcity, a figure that rises to 70% in southern Europe during summers. Europe is vulnerable to climate change, and addressing it is also a matter of national security because it touches to the very survival of countries and their people. With temperature rising and more extreme weather events, it's not hard to notice that the climate is changing. People can understand the changes in their landscapes and in their way of life. Finally, on the civilizational point, it has been pushed a lot recently, but there are 2 points that I think are worth highlighting. First, a civilization is not set in stones. Just like a language, it evolves with time according to how people want to live and what they aspire to, and history has shown this. And I, secondly, hardly believe that he embodies the Christian values he's referring to, of loving his neighbor, helping the poor and the vulnerable, strangers, compassion and mercy, justice and defending the rights of the oppressed and the vulnerable, generosity, integrity and truth, etc. So from this standpoint, his discourse doesn't feel legitimate and actually more of an attack as well on Western civilizational values. The European response was a mixture of steel and stoicism. Boris Pistorius and Emmanuel Macron led the charge, essentially telling the US, if you want to do it alone, we'll learn to live without you. Pistorius, the German defense minister, was blunt. He acknowledged that international organizations need reform, but warned that a great power going it alone won't work in a world of competing giants. His message to Rubio was NATO must remain transatlantic, and to do that it must become more European. Combined, European armies now outnumber any other single force in the world. They are spending record amounts, but as Pistorius noted, predictability and reliability are the only things that keep an alliance together. By excluding Europeans from negotiations over their own continent's security, the US is strengthening its adversaries. Similarly, the US Senator Elisa Slotkin recalled that there was a saying when she worked in the Pentagon that said, "Don't talk about them without them." And that if you want Europeans to be part of the ultimate settlement, which Trump says he does, then the Europeans should be at the table. Macron also addressed leaders at the conference. His speech was about independence. He argued that Europe must become a geopolitical power in its own right, in defense, technology, and energy. He acknowledged that Europe has to learn to become a geopolitical power because it was not part of our DNA. The EU is first a political construction to provide peace, which it has delivered. It is a single market to provide growth and prosperity, which is also delivered. And the third step, according to him, is to become a geopolitical power. Macron's other interesting point was on digital sovereignty. He challenged the tech bros version of free speech, meaning free speech would mean I will give the mind, the brain, the heart of my teenagers to algorithms of the big guys, he asked. He called for a ban on social media for under 15s, arguing that European Aufklärung, enlightenment, defines free speech as having rules and respect, not a lawless digital space filled with hate speech and disinformation fueled by Chinese or American algorithms. This is the opposite of what the tech bros like Musk or Peter Thiel want. But their ambition to dismantle the EU that is out in the open only reinforces the determination of European leaders to put some limits to the social media jungle. On Ukraine, the mood was grim. The US is pushing for the Anchorage formula, demanding Ukraine cede its fortified Donbas lines, and experts found it unlikely that Russia would want to come to the negotiation table, locking Ukraine in this war. Also, it is accepted that a peace deal would speed up Ukraine's accession to the EU, which is the exact opposite of what Russia wants since 2014 and before. Plus, while the US wavers, Ukraine has been forced to innovate. Its frontline is now massively automated. AI-driven drones and remote turrets have replaced soldiers, and Ukraine has little incentive to give in to Russia so that they can attack land that is harder to defend years later. And Deputy Prime Minister of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, reminded the audience that Russia is conducting its third historical attempt to erase the Ukrainian people. From the 19th century book bans to the 19th century Holodomor, when 5 million Ukrainians were starved to death by a Soviet-made famine, to the missiles of today. Ukraine, aided by the Europeans, is protecting its sovereignty and agency. And when asked if Russia always wins on the long game, Taras Kachka, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, quipped, Russia won World War II because Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. So with Ukraine, it is possible. Without Ukraine, it is impossible. And history shows that Russia is indeed not invincible, from the Crimean War to the Cold War. While some headlines suggest a European pivot toward Beijing, the actual temperature in the Munich halls was different. The real movement wasn't about finding a new master, it was about becoming more independent. The talk was of strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe must build its own industrial giants capable of scaling up. Europe has the innovation, the researchers, and has historically allowed its best ideas to be bought by Silicon Valley or subsidized by Beijing. The consensus at the conference was a push for a European first policy, particularly in defense and critical sectors. Why? Because, as leader pointed out, when you buy a US fighter jet or Chinese 5G stack, you aren't just buying hardware, you're buying a permanent fine print of control. You are importing dependencies that can be weaponized against you. To protect the core of European sovereignty, the EU is now moving to create its own champions, giving them the scale and regulatory shield to compete with the US and China on equal footing. However, there is a loud, persistent political discourse suggesting that if the US continues its protectioning wrecking ball path, Europe should strike major deals with China to counter the pressure. I believe this is profoundly misguided. Doing deals with Beijing to spite Washington is like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. The fundamental rot of Chinese markets hasn't changed. The IP theft is still a feature, not a bug. You can invest money, but you can't take it out easily. And access to the market is always conditional. To hedge against Trump's N% tariff by handing European businesses and economy to a state that uses overcapacity as a weapon is a strategic suicide mission. The discussion in the panels seems to recognize that the only real answer is European unification, investing in Europe's own scale-ups, issuing European bonds for defense, and realizing that European values aren't just opinions, they are the laws that govern the digital and physical borders today and will protect the EU's future. Beyond the trade wars and the NATO scrambles, Munich 2026 put a spotlight on a much deeper fracture, the total erosion of the international legal system. Many delegates, particularly from the Global South, pointed to a credibility gap that has become a canyon. The West speaks of rules-based order when defending Ukraine, but that same decisiveness is nowhere to be found when it comes to Gaza. While the International Criminal Court, ICC, has indicted Benjamin Netanyahu and the International Court of Justice has ruled the Israeli occupation illegal, the world watches as these rulings are simply ignored. This selective enforcement isn't just a political disagreement. It is the death of the idea of universal law. And the International Court of Justice has ruled the Israeli occupation of Palestine illegal. The world watches as these rulings are simply ignored. Netanyahu just doesn't travel to an ICC member state and he continues the occupation. This selective enforcement isn't just a political disagreement, it is a death knell for the idea of universal law. For decades, the Global South has argued that the international system was built by the West for the West. In 2026, they aren't arguing it anymore, they're affirming it, and they are highlighting the lack of urgency for many other conflicts. For example, in Sudan, the call in Munich was for less talking, more acting, because the humanitarian aid remains a pittance compared to the billions poured into military hardware elsewhere. The realization is setting in and voiced out that for many in the international community, some lives are simply more strategic than others. This selective humanity is what is truly destroying the foundations of the post-World War system. It brings us to the ultimate question: what is the future of the United Nations? In 2026, the US is facing a liquidity crisis driven by the US withdrawing dues and a hiring freeze that has paralyzed its agencies. And there are three distinct scenarios that are possible in the coming years. The League of Nations scenario, meaning the dissolution. Some voices in the MAGA administration and elsewhere want to effectively end the UN by defunding it into non-existence. The consequences would be hard to deal with. We don't know it, but the UN helps manage many aspects of our lives. And if the UN disappears on Friday, we'd be scrambling to reinvent it by Monday, to manage everything from refugee flows to international aviation and pandemic response. Without a central forum, we would descend into a dog-eat-dog world of regional hegemony and the multiplication of different standards and norms instead of alignment. There is also the managed arena option, which is more or less what is happening today. In this scenario, the UN survives but loses its soul. It becomes a sterile arena where the US and China simply trade vetoes, paralyzing any meaningful action on human rights and security. And the final option is a reform. For example, the UN 80 reform, that is the Global South's hope. There is a push led by the UN 80 initiative to fundamentally restructure the Security Council. The goal is to give more agency to the Global South and middle powers, moving away from the P5 veto power model that has paralyzed the body for 80 years. But is reform even possible when the people holding the wrecking ball are the ones who have to sign the checks? And even in this scenario, adopting resolutions is not the end of the fight. The real issue is their implementation, as seen with Israel. And having a body enforcing international law is something that most countries will not accept, as it would be seen as an infringement on their sovereignty. So if we don't build something more inclusive and consistently principled, we aren't just watching the destruction of an organization, we're watching the destruction of the very idea of international justice. In this context, Ivan Krasnev said, "There is a world that could be worse than liberal hypocrisy, and it is a world without hypocrisy at all. Because then everything is about power and who is strong enough to impose its will." The Munich 2026 conference proved that the old world is indeed changing, but what replaces it doesn't have to be a wrecking ball. It could be a Europe that is finally assertive, independent, and proud of a civilization that actually lives up to its values rather than just using them as leverage. If we ignore the moral threats today, history, especially the 1930s, tells us exactly how this ends. It's important to stop treating principles as luxuries we can no longer afford, because in the end, they are foundational to the Western civilization and make it worth defending. So thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you very soon in the next video.